bring in Omar Baddar. He's a Palestinian-American political analyst. He joins us via Zoom from Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us here today. What do you think this killing says about Israel's occupation and the impunity it seems to enjoy?
Look, this is a really horrific murder by an Israeli army that has utter disregard for Palestinian life because of a culture of dehumanization where they don't see Palestinians as equal human beings, and a culture of impunity that is well documented by every major human rights organization in the world, where simply they don't get held accountable, or hardly ever, when they commit horrific crimes against Palestinians. And that culture has created a pattern in which journalists and medics and human rights activists are regularly targeted with killings and shootings and beatings. And that really happened to hit home more in this case just because of who Shireen was, because she's a household name in much of the Arab world. And she was an embodiment of journalistic integrity and bravery. And on top of that, she was an American citizen, and that garnered her more attention. But this really is simply what the Israeli occupation does day in and day out. It is really an attempt to enforce a system of brutal apartheid, and that does entail a lot of violence against Palestinians.
And what do you make of the mainstream Western media coverage, which appears to consistently hesitate from holding Israel responsible?
Look, the way much of mainstream U.S. media, what I'm exposed to, has dealt with this is really an affront to journalistic integrity. They have refused to lay responsibility for this killing where it belongs with the Israeli army. You know, they keep referencing to Shireen being killed by bullets without ever mentioning who fired the bullets. And that's because they take Israeli government propaganda at face value in a way that is just utterly shocking and makes absolutely no sense. If you just compare it to what's happening in Ukraine, U.S. mainstream media makes very clear that the Russian government cannot be trusted when it comes to its word about the crimes being committed against Ukraine, because Russia is an invading and occupying force. And yet, even though Israel has been an invading and occupying force in the Palestinian territories for many decades, somehow there is a different standard there. And even though they have a lengthy record of dishonest propaganda that is disproved by endless documentation by the United Nations and by human rights organizations, they still do this both sides reporting where they say they don't know what actually happened because the Israeli government claims something. And that really is something that absolutely has to change. That double standard that Israel gets to get away with to whitewash its own crimes with American media complicity is a very, very serious problem and distorts the American public's perception of events that are unfolding under occupation in Palestine.
And the US government also failing to hold Israel accountable for the killing of an American citizen. What's your take on that?
It's worth noting here also that this is the second American citizen killed this year. There was also an 80-year-old grandfather, Omar Baddar, who was also blindfolded and handcuffed and left for dead in the freezing dead of night a few months ago as well. And you have a situation in which the U.S. in this case is welcoming an Israeli investigation into this killing, which again is just so transparently absurd. You logically just cannot have the killers investigate themselves and expect anything serious to come of that. And you also have a documented record in which Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and even Israeli human rights organizations saying that Israel's record of investigating itself amounts to nothing more than whitewashing its own crimes, that they will never obviously hold themselves accountable. And what is needed in this case is an independent investigation into what Israel has done. And frankly, a U.S. investigation as well, given the fact that this is an American citizen who was killed in this case. And beyond that, what you really need, given the fact that it's not about just this one individual crime, but an extremely lengthy record of crimes against humanity that are very, very thoroughly documented, with the U.S. essentially bankrolling those crimes with $3.8 billion every single year, more than they give to any other country in the world, in military funding that Israel then uses to turn to operate its war machine against the Palestinian people in its effort to destroy Palestinian society. And we have to make clear that U.S. military funding to Israel must stop until Israel abides by international law and respects human rights and starts treating Palestinians like equal human beings.
OK, Omar Baddar, Palestinian-American political analyst. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you.